So, Mirene, Pegah, and Suneil, please.
Hi. Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for coming. See many familiar faces. Thank you, RT East. Thank you, Eflux. Thank you, Amal. Actually, Amal did not mention that she curated the selection, so I just wanted to say that. And perhaps, yes, involve her as well in our conversation at some point. Thank you, Pegah, and thank you, Suneil, for being here. So I've prepared a few notes for a discussion on diaspora, but we can also improvise and just see where the conversation takes us. Also, I noticed things while I was watching this, because I was watching the viewing links that Amal sent me, and on the big screen it's very, very different. So I just added a few things that we could talk about. But I think I'm interested in thinking about diaspora as a place of articulation, and as a position from which to look at history and understand its violence from a distance that enables one to discern or grasp the size of the catastrophe, which is what Basma says in her film, in her video. And we can discuss the nature of that distance as well, because it's a very fraught and complicated distance, which has its own politics, I guess. But I wanted to begin with a question on subtitles, because suddenly the subtitles were so striking to me when I was watching these videos together, and how important they were to each narrative and each video, but also sort of presented a kind of aesthetic. The subtitle as translation, so the subtitle that addresses an audience that possibly does not understand the language of the film, of the video, so already indicates a kind of a different kind of audience from the audience from which, or from the sort of context from which the filmmaker produced the film. But also the subtitles as this kind of stabilizing text, or this sort of standardized or codified text that sort of acts or sort of provides another layer that is not the live spoken voice. So it was interesting in subtitles, and in your film, Suneil, the subtitles are not like, or do you place them at the center of the image? And I was interested in that choice. And also, it's not a translation, right? Because the language is English, and the subtitles, the text is also in English. So perhaps, I don't know, we can begin by talking about subtitles and the role, how you see them, or what role do they have for you and for your films and videos? I don't know.
Yeah, thank you. The subtitle, the politics of the subtitle, like as you said, this, subtitles are usually meant to stand in for someone else's language, and I think there's a kind of violence that happens with subtitles at times, where it's kind of meant to once again either replicate or interrupt the person speaking, and so it sometimes can even potentially take agency away from that person who's speaking. And so I I used to edit videos like for the internet, like social media videos, and my job was to subtitle everything, which was done out of accessibility, and something accessibility is super important and just interesting on its own right. And so I was very used to subtitling everything, not more as a practice, as sort of turning the voice into text, and the centering of the subtitle in the middle was a way, and I also have like, drop shadows and things like that, these kind of like, digital trompe-l'oeil effects, and for me, it's a way of kind of like prioritizing the text over the image, and as a way to turn what my father was saying into a sort of record of a sort of document, to think of the interview as a piece of text, just as the film was bookended by Stuart Hall's interview, which is also turned into a text in some of his selected selected works. And so, yeah, I just think about that relationship of turning, kind of prioritizing and giving priority to the image. Also, something happens when you're hearing something in the same language that you're reading it in. There's a way in which it like really reaffirms or helps to really have the mind sink, and it helps to digest the information that's being spoken at times. Yeah.
Well, my case is a little bit different because I speak Persian, and I have had this practice of making films with my mom. Like, my mom is in all of my films, and we have these jokes that, like, she says something and she's like, do not subtitle that. So for me, that is like, in a way, I interpret that as like an act of agency, that how much accessibility I want to give to a person of not that community. What are the things that I'm revealing and what are the things that I'm not? And specifically coming from Iran, we have like this very strong notion of like, who is like, inside and who is outside, who is in, who gets to know what, So for me, it is like subtitles are a way for me to insert my agency in a lot of ways, and it acts also in a way as a translation of like my diasporic being, that like you're all the time in this state of translation. Like how am I able to basically say, what is this childish song that I'm singing? Like what are the role of symbols, like how can I say less of what is being there? So yeah, in a way, the agency, and it has kind of, because of subtitling, like I've had to change, like things have changed a lot in my practice, because I don't want people to constantly look at written English language, because that is what really bothers me on a day-to-day basis, So I've kind of gravitated more towards saying less and just like, becoming more gestural rather than verbal. Like, for example, in this program, like there were a lot of singing, I think like there's a universal language to that it could be translated also.
Right. And I think the gestural is there also in Munira's video with the dance move, the choreography. Also in your film, Suneil, you sort of direct the attention to the hand as well, the position of the hand and the confidence. So definitely, I think the body and the language and the choreography of the body also creates another level of meaning, I guess. But I guess I just maybe wanted to follow up with something that you said in your video, Suneil, about diaspora or identity being created at a distance within sort of the diasporic condition. One sort of performs or create an identity from a position, let's say, a position of exile or a position of distance. And I was thinking about the role of the camera or the role of witnessing and creating narratives. I feel like a lot of these films are addressing the camera. Munira's film, for example, is a filming of Syrian refugees in the Netherlands. I think in your film, Suneil, you film your father, and interview him or ask him questions about his childhood, but also his life in the U.S. And then your video, Pegah, you're also speaking directly to the camera, as a matter of fact. And so I was just thinking about the role of image making in creating the diasporic experience. So the diasporic experience doesn't really exist outside of these narratives, right? That we create from a distance or from an elsewhere. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that kind of. I don't know if this is a question or a comment, but I was just thinking of the creation of narratives as a way of like witnessing something. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or if that's.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I kind of framed it more as a question, right? Like, so how can identity, or like, I don't even remember what the question was in my film, but something about how can diaspora be understood at a distance. And specifically, I was thinking about like how images change our relationship to questions of diaspora, and how screen-based images in particular change our relationship to that, as they inherently change our relationship to time and space, right? So the way in which I was able to communicate with my father across distances, and the immediacy of that contact, it led me to think, like, is there an immediacy to being in a place that I have a deep connection to, but have never been, or hadn't been at that point? Since the making of this film in 2019, I've been many times, which is kind of its own story, but funny that it took me making a film about not being somewhere for me to go somewhere.
Yeah.
And it's like I had to get this film out of my system to just be like, yeah, but what are you waiting for?
Right.
And so the question was more about like, how do these images sort of reframe our understanding, whether it's like images from parallel cinema, and or images of like a burning Portuguese slave ship, as well as images of commissioned drone videography, right? I was asking someone else to see for me in my place because I was not there, and so it was just a different. And the Google Maps, right? It all started with the Google Maps because I was alone, sad and depressed at one point in my bed, and like just scrolling through images of Goa, and happened upon this really this 360 panorama, and had moved the kind of cursor where the camera pointed in on itself. And at that point, the camera the camera refused to recognize itself as a camera. So the camera disappeared itself. And what you're left with is this kind of this enmeshment of like bodies and limbs and skin and books and the landscape and the Jeep that they were like driving in, and like the red clay soil in Goa. And that image was it was the first image that you see in the film, was basically what led me on this now almost 6-year journey, like almost 6 to 6.5 year journey, just through that immediate encounter with my phone of this kind of broken image of a landscape.
Well, in my case, it's really funny. The first time my entire family got access to a means of videography was after my aunt got this opportunity to study abroad for a postdoc in Canada, and she came back in early 90s with this what is it called, camera, like Handycam. And I come from a very big family, and we would share this camera between us. So the first time that we actually got to have any moving image record of the family was after my aunt came back. So for me, that speaks to your question about distance, and like, that, I don't know, the distance probably gave her this desire to think about looking at, and like also to capture. That is one thing. The other thing is that I made this film when I was in Iran. this film is made before I left. My condition of being away has only changed my lens in a way, because I still work with, like, these 4 hours of home movie that I have. I just think that the state and the way that I think about it has changed. Like, I came to have a more holistic understanding of it. And again, backing to your mention of distance, like I like very early on at film school, they showed us this film by Dreyer called Joan of the Arc, which everything is like, we're shot in close-ups. And that film was brutal for me to watch. Like, not because of the subject matter, I think because of how close we were to this subject all the time. Then they taught us, like, to narrate a smooth narrative. Like, you gotta have, like, adjust your distance. And for me, in terms of these very personal narratives, I really think that it's just like being away gave me this access to adjust my distance and have different angles.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point in terms of distance, both in filmic language and geographic distance, the distance of the diaspora. And I guess what I was trying to get at with my question, and now it's clearer to me, is how I feel that the condition of diaspora can lead to reasserting certain kind of essentialist narratives about identity. And what I think your films are doing is resisting that, right? So via the kinds of multiple textures of images and the sort of collages. Also, and I'm thinking about Basma's film as well, of the voice and the images and the sort of fragmented nature of the narrative. I think it resists this kind of the cohesion or of a single identity, or it means to be this or that. Yeah, so I think this is what I was trying to get to. But just going back maybe to the nature of the image, also in your film, Suneil, maybe you can talk, like, most of the films besides Munira's use like archives. Perhaps you can talk. I was interested, or I was intrigued in your film in particular, Suneil, about how you juxtapose drone images with computer-generated images, with archival images. And so, and I really appreciated that, because I do feel sometimes that the archive comes with a very sort of heavy aesthetic, and you've managed to break that a little bit in your film. And so I was curious just to hear your thoughts about the different kinds of images that you use, and how these different textures also speak to a certain kind of diasporic experience, or yeah.
Yeah, I mean, also just to go back to your last point about the kind of the power of diaspora as this agent that potentially has the ability to resist, let's say, state-based consolidation of identity, which is really just an enclosure, a sort of a way of defining this aspect of being that so many people, around the world, of different ethnic backgrounds are able to tap into. And I think that there's something that is inherently resisting the nation state and works against the nation state, because if the nation state is about consolidating power, diaspora is a radical dispersal away from that. It is about an expansion, whereas like state-based consolidation of identity is about contraction and isolating and defining. And inherently diaspora is moves against. It's so much more fluid, and it moves against definition, because there's no one way of being Iranian or Goan or whatever else, that there's so many ways, and they take on new meaning every place that they move to. So I'm interested in that in relationship to images too, how images travel. So I think that the kind of juxtaposition of the textures of these images. I mean, I also have ADD, and so it's like I get really bored at like looking at some certain image, and I'm like, okay, what's next? What's next? What's next? But I think that like the different textures are also a way of kind of being able to shift boundaries and shift borders, right? To kind of shift away from one register of experience, right? And to hopefully do that fluidly and to fluidly and seamlessly traverse these borders. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if you want to add anything.
I mean, my film was pretty homogenized in terms of
yes,
visual.
But you do
aesthetic.
well. Yes, but also, so there is like archival footage, right, of you as a 7-year-old, and then there is you in the recent present, or like 7 or 8 years ago before you leave Iran, and yet you decide to stick to a certain aesthetic, let's say. There's no like real rupture between the past and the present. And I wonder if you could speak to that choice of keeping a sort of continuity between these two kinds of footage.
Well, there wasn't that much of choice, to be perfectly honest. I didn't have money, and like that's how I became an experimental artist, like because the access to like means of big production and like all the films that we see of Iranian, people like in Cannes and here and there. First of all, they're mostly men, and then they have massive access to big production. Like I just didn't have that, and I was very frustrated, and I wanted to make something about it. So I had a compact camera, and there was also nobody that would support me, like in the family, like, can you come take a picture of me? So I had to figure out something that I was also extremely alone. I was just like right before I was leaving. So I didn't want any disruption between me and the camera. And there are certain elements that were accidental. For example, that carpet that is there, like that's the carpet that has been in our family like for generations. Like it comes from my grandfather, like, to my mother, to me. So, and that is also the same carpet that is in the old footage. So for me, like these are like the threads that are in unison in a way in these two like separate kind of temporalities, but also it's life itself that past and present are so enmeshed in a way. Yeah, and I also got bored of like watching that thing for a long time. It's like 4 or 5 minutes, and I was just like, how do I do this?
I had a question, and then I think I forgot it. Oh yes, so something about maybe what you were talking about, Suneil, and also something a sort of a trope that is common to many of the videos, and perhaps common to the experience of diaspora, is this relationship between, let's say, the self and the collective. So in Munira's film, for example, one of the narrators says, I had to leave, in order this, and I had to, and I think she talks about like reckoning with her own self and making this choice away from the community, and not wanting, let's say, the community that she's perhaps used to. So there's a sort of emergence of the self against the collective, but there's also there's always a return to the collective, or there's always a return to the conditions of departure. And I'm thinking here also in your film, Suneil, about the various like liberation struggles that you mention, and so this a politicized past, right, around which groups were organized or coalesced. And if I have to think about, let's say, a diaspora in the contemporary world, I sometimes struggle to think about a politicized movement around diaspora. I feel at this stage it's very atomized, perhaps. And although the experiences are always connected to a historical event, right, either a war or economic collapse, etc., I feel that perhaps there isn't a lot of organizing around the conditions that led to the catastrophe, or maybe there is, but it's not really foregrounded in the discourse, in the diasporic discourse, or at least in the diasporic imagination or aesthetic, let's say. And I appreciated the fact that you mentioned, and also Basma mentions the Madrid conference in 1991. And so there are these references to sort of historical, like pivotal historical moments. And I think there's this tension, there is dialectic between the narrative of the self and the narrative of history, and how these two sometimes converge and sometimes not.
Yeah, I love everything you just said. I think in the particular case of Goa, it's really interesting too, because the liberation movement for Goa was really one of uniting with India versus the liberation struggles in Mozambique and Angola and Guinea-Bissau and Sao Tome and Principe and all these other Portuguese colonies were one of national independence, right? Of sovereignty.
Yeah.
But Goa wanted to be part of India, right? Or rather, India said, "You are now Goa is now a part of India." Whether or not Goans ever wanted independence is another issue, but it's once again that kind of tension between like the collective, right, and this question of self-governance, the question of quote unquote sovereignty, and I think it's a very rich question to engage in terms of the present moment of political organizing. And once again, as Goa being a part of India, right, but also having an extremely different history in many ways, where Goa was very isolated because it was under 450 years of colonialism by the Portuguese and didn't gain independence or didn't gain liberation. It didn't gain liberation until 14 years after independence of India. And so for many years, Goans could not, for their up until liberation, could not go to India. You had to have a passport to go to the place you were. Yeah. And so I think it's also like, as the kind of grouping on the subcontinent of South Asia, where there's so many different political struggles happening, but right now in India, where there's ethno-nationalist fascism happening proper, where there's an out in the open genocide against Muslim populations in India, the question of what we do here in the U.S., it's a really important, the question of mobilization of the diaspora is something I think about on a regular basis, and it's really dire. It's dark, when only 100 people show up in D.C. when Modi comes and hugs Biden. It's just only 3 out of 500 something Congress people protested, right, who said, we're gonna abstain from Modi's speech. It's just such a dire circumstance, and it's diaspora that also enables this fascism to happen, because you have so much funding from India to the U.S. and then back and forth. Totally. So, there's a darker side to that too.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that.
I got really worked up for a second.
No, absolutely.
Well, Iran's situation is very complicated to portray at the moment. But, my entire film is about this. I am not really referencing the history from, from the facts or from other people. I'm not reciting. I'm just, I think there's been just so many recitation about Iran. There's been enough essays and enough intellectualism that when I was making this film, I was in pain, and I'm still in pain. So for the way that I relate to this is like through an embodied painful experience that like even my mobilization, is dependent on a hub of departure, aka as airport, which like, Khomeini's name is on it.
Right.
So for me, this like whether it was the coup that happened, 40 years ago, that was like, I don't know, the hands of the Great Britain and the United States was in it, or whether the consolidation of like, the powers of these regime apologists, like with like our very good Democratic Party in the States. Like, it's just like so difficult to talk about it. So, again, very painful because like in terms of like thinking about organizing, the situation that Iran is experiencing now, we have like an Islamofascist regime. It's like the opposite. It's just so interesting, like to see like the extremities of the situation. But what is happening here is that like we cannot apply the intellectual framework of West into the situation of Iran. And for me to have these conversations with like, the diaspora culture, whose like, knowledge mostly comes from like Eurocentric knowledge, is very difficult to say that like, yes, there's just like so many things to be addressed, like this political binary that we have in the United States is definitely not benefiting any of us, but like, the question of Democratic versus Republican Party, like, does not also relate like to my geography, the way that it relates in the States. So to me, I think the best thing that we can all do as a collective is to have these conversations, like, because I really don't think that the government should do anything, other than sitting tight and like withholding themselves,
Yeah.
But to have conversations of addressal,
Yeah, thank you. Perhaps at this point, I'd like to bring in Amal in the conversation, maybe Arte East, because on a more sort of meta level, I feel like Arte East is creating this archive of videos that includes filmmakers and artists such as Suneil and Pegah and many others. And I'm interested in the kind of in the collection, again, in the curation of who is in this archive, and the kinds of voices that are included, and what that says about this particular moment of history or this particular moment of artistic production in the Middle East and beyond. And so, Amal, perhaps, I don't know if you want to speak to your browsing of the archive, your selection, why you selected these films in particular, besides the fact that they're amazing, but any other thought or criteria?
Okay, just one. I don't want to speak. Jinou can speak more about the archive of Arte East, but basically this program is to the brief is to pick at least one film from the archive and put it in conversation with more contemporary works. And what was I going to say? Yeah, the archive of Arte East is also not necessarily an intentional, wasn't made with the purpose of archiving, but rather with programming and showing and screening. And they also ended up, as far as I know, having sometimes like the only copies of some very important historical films of Amir Alai and so on that could not be found anywhere else, like even by the filmmaker themselves.
Yeah.
So anyhow, this program started with the Basma Sharif's Everywhere Was the Same, which was one of the films among many others, and there are like thousands of films in this list. So it started there, and and I was very struck not just by the film, but also by the title and by the statement that says that everywhere was the same, and that how it could be spun also everywhere is the same if you are wondering where the hell to go these days and where the hell to live. But also everywhere was the same as everybody is leaving. So people are leaving so many countries. You know, diaspora is all around us, and I don't mean it just, you know, like globalization and mobility and people moving, but I mean precisely of a people dispersed because of catastrophic reasons. And I wanted to put them in because, like, also with Basma's film, I am the daughter of a refugee who was born a refugee, and I grew up a Palestinian refugee, was born in Lebanon. And I grew up in Lebanon, and a lot of people around us were leaving, but my parents never left. But then I grew up and I left, and with my kids, and then there's this generational thing where, like, you inherit a diaspora, but you also create another one, and so I wanted to put like the then, and so that the Palestinian diaspora anyway was a blueprint, but now we have all of these contemporary diasporas as well, and
Thank you. I was going to suggest if there are questions from the audience for our filmmakers. I think Shireen has a question. Oh, sorry.
It's okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for this wonderful program, first of all. I mean, it's the first time I see some of the films Pegah I have seen before. Just talking about the archive, like Amal said, it's an accidental archive. It's an accumulation of films that have been programmed or submitted over 20 years. So part of this project is to research this archive, because right now it's, you know, in storage. We're trying to figure out what to do with it, how to get money to preserve it. So unpacking the ArteArchive is exactly that. We invite curators to look at the archive and be inspired from there as a starting point to create a program and dialogue with other artists. So we have this happening monthly on artearchive.org. For anybody interested, it's free. And then we also have these in-person programs that sometimes accompany it. So you're all welcome to watch the online programs.
Thank you.
I'll give you back the conversation.
I think we had a question at the back. I think Shireen is just sitting.
Someone had a question.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody. I love the dialogue between the movies and, of course, Mirene's interventions. And I was thinking about decolonization because there are mentions of freedom fighters throughout. And I was thinking about this question of, you know, how is it possible to maintain this movement of decolonization while constantly having to live in exile, mostly in the West? And then this question of pain and joy that I thought was so really moving, you know, this question of like the V, but there's also so much joy. For example, in Munira's movie, in your movie, you know, when you're a child, and in your movie, joy with nature, this question of being alive. And so I was thinking, how can we sort of imagine, you know, decolonization through pain, through exile, through the diaspora, and this idea, this question of finding joy, finding life together.
Thank you. Do any of you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I want to go back to my mom. Like, my mom's generation have lived through so much pain, and like horrible historical events have happened to them. And to this date, every single day she wakes up, she picks some flowers and put it, like, you know, in a tiny vase, and she talks to our cat, and that is how it goes. And she had taught me like the joy of resistance, how to embody, like how to basically live is resistance sometimes. So for me, it is important to say that, yes, that is painful, but like I am having the utmost, outwardly experience. My mom is braiding my hair, like, and I'm just like getting ready for school. Yes, it's like in uniform. Like, yes, it doesn't seem like the best option of like, covering, but there's joy even in the worst possible, moments of one's life. In terms of decolonization, I also want to talk about the forms that we choose. Like, for example, for me, it is very important to work with home movie because since I remember I was surrounded by the state propaganda visual regime, other than the, the way that they controlled our body and everything, we had only access to certain kind of visuals. And the realness was happening in our handycams, in our family albums. So for me, the choice of form became really important, like discovering my artistic voice, that like, how can I think about dismantling what is basically surrounding us? Like, the question of decolonization, like, it's very difficult to address it, like about Iran, because like it just like goes back, like, the people who are ruling Iran are Iranians. If I want to go back, like I think it's a lot of I have to unload so much, But I just want to call attention that the form we choose is also a way of like hacking the system.
Yeah, I also think of, I think it was Munira's film, and I think it had to do with Sharjah Biennial or something, but the title of it was If I Can't Dance, I Don't Want to Part of Your Revolution, which I think is a quote from, is it Emma Goldman, or is that Lucy Parsons, or one of those radical, it's Emma Goldman, right? Yeah. If I can't dance, I don't want to be a part of your revolution. Yeah, I think about that quote a lot. It's such a good line. So, I mean, I think the idea of joy within revolution or decolonization is essential in so many ways, and I see that. I mean, there's so many lines in Munira's film specifically that point to that. What's the title of the film again? It's
Freedom is a habit I'm trying to learn.
Freedom is a habit I'm trying to learn. Yeah, I've seen Munira's work before. I hadn't seen this film. I actually programmed one of Munira's films a while ago, but I hadn't seen that before. And yeah, so I mean, I think her film really gets to the core of that, and it's something I'm interested in exploring as well. I don't know that my film necessarily explored that so much, other than some level of like play, as you were saying, with like materials and with images and the way in which you can slip between boundaries. And I wanted to have fun in making my films, right? Otherwise, what's the point? Art can sometimes be such a miserable thing, and you have to kind of remember to have fun and have joy in making these works that have really difficult and dense topics. So, yeah, maybe that's what I'll say about that. I think we're good. Oh.
I just found the way you facilitated the discussion super. It stirred a lot of things for me. Also, being a diasporic subject, and in particular, I think the one thing I would love for you two to talk about is the question about the role of image in the performance of the diasporic subject, and how maybe films or even just Instagram, the way that we portray ourselves on these platforms, what does that do to make us feel what we are, like the complexity of this identity sort of comes to life through these medium. And I'm saying that not having Instagram, and I'm actually just rediscovering Instagram, and I realized that there's there's an aesthetic also to being a diasporic subject, and I wonder what it does, and I wonder if my issue with being the diasporic subject I am is because I have not had Instagram and I have not been able to like put it out there in a way, and maybe it would come to life in a different way if I had. I don't know. These are just like broad thoughts and not really well constructed, but if you have anything to
Get
say.
off Instagram.
Yeah, I'm just there to watch what people do, but
You're
I
a-
don't do
you're a
anything
lurker.
myself.
You're a
Yeah.
lurker, aren't you?
It's only been 3 days. I don't intend to stay.
Oh, man. Yeah, it is. Do you have any immediate thoughts?
Yes, I do.
Oh, please.
Do you want to go first? Well, I think what happens when you have a diasporic life, it becomes that like when you're going back and forth, if you do, like you're always like, state of like, being a tourist for certain fragments of time. Whether that is like, I don't know, like seeing your parents' new furniture, or like this new dish that your mom got to cook, or whether it is like, I don't know, the new hairstyle that like, one of your family members has. Like I myself, like, since I had an iPhone, like this is our situation in my family. Like I sit, my mom sits, and like I'm like, Mom, this is alive, and it's not alive. Like so I have like just so many hours of her talking, and then like it just like turns into like I'm interviewing her, and she has this like performative moments that she's like I don't want the audience to do this and do that, like and then I come back to the States and like I look at all this distance and how these like tiny little moments have become this memento for me, like the only memento like for me to be connected and not like constantly feel like tourists. And specifically about Iran, like every few months things change massively, like in the urban planning, like you go there, like I don't know how to get to my home, and with the economy, like since I have moved, I think my parents have moved 3 houses. So for me, like this navigation, like is interesting. And I'm also dealing with like this anxiety that Instagram brings to my life. So I delete it every couple of days, and then I remove myself off of Instagram. And then there's somebody like, can you promote this for us? And then I'm like, sure. I come back, and I come back, and until the next like rush of anxiety that like I feel that I gotta go off. And then every single time my mom is like, oh, I can't find you on Instagram. And I'm like, yes, that's the goal. And she's like, but I just want to see your day-to-day life. So for me, it's just like, it's like a personal media, for them. But I'm just trying to be more conscious of it and not exploit everything with it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's really beautiful. It's beautiful and heartbreaking at the same time. But I think it points to this idea of like, similarly how I like, use like Skype kind of instantaneous communication. The speed at which we can be connected with one another is, reveals new possibilities about diaspora that perhaps, some decades ago were not quite as possible. For me, a lot of it is about being intentional with like my connections and my community. And I grew up in Texas, and so like I grew up very, very, very far away from India, and there were lots of South Asians, but it was like there was a very deep kind of internalized, white supremacy that existed growing up in Texas specifically, as an Indian kid, and so I think having the ability now and the kind of awareness and care and intentionality of trying to forge connections across the diaspora that perhaps had at the benefit once again of white supremacy been severed, right? Or perhaps I didn't have the kind of awareness or language or you know, intentionality to try and foster more connection, not just with Goans, but certainly with Goans, but South Asians at large, and sort of like really admiring and like dwelling in the vastness of us as a multitudinous people, and understanding the region as a subcontinent that has been specifically divided by colonial powers and by people in power, but by you know, having this ability to connect to not just like community activists, but individuals, right? And appreciate other people's work, and being able to, you know, hopefully be able to be in conversation, or you know, at the very least in conversation, but even potentially in collaboration. You know, the music that that was made for this film, but then I've worked with her on every single film since. Her name is Amrita Kadambi. She's Tamil, and we basically just met and connect. I had never heard her music before, but we were just like, oh, hey, you're South Asian, and we kind of connected over our politics first. And I had never heard her music, and I was like, I want you to make the music for my film. I have no idea what kind of music you make. And she's like, I've never made music for a film. And so we did this trade, and I made her a music video, and then she kind of composed the score for this film. And I was just so blown away by it. But it was just like, it was operating primarily on like a very specific feeling and intentionality about politics. Because, yeah, you have to be quite careful, because not everyone in the diaspora is going to have, I mean, nor should they, but you know, there is a lot of folks, specifically I'm speaking in the South Asian diaspora, that do not have you know, a politics that is, let's say, anti-fascist, and by that I mean specifically, very literally, fascism is happening, and the diaspora is spreading it, right? And so, being intentional about who I'm able to connect with. It's not just, you know, it's like there has to be a shared kind of understanding. But Instagram does help. It helps in that regard, you know, it helps to connect and, you know, severed ties, right? To some degree. And then other degrees, it's just like, you know, I reach out to someone, they're like, I want to have nothing to do with you, you know? So yeah, it's not, you know, it's not always so easy.
It's complicated, I think, with Instagram. Because it's really a question of like immediacy, distance, proximity. And I feel, you know, algorithmically, you know, groups are created, and it's a kind of echo chamber of sharing information that is relevant to that group. But also, everyone feels a little bit like in exile in Instagram, or like othered or alone. And so there's also this constant feeling of like not belonging to Instagram, but then being this sort of constantly sort of, you know, being addicted to this anxiety that you're talking about, or wanting to belong, right? And so constantly sort of, at least that's one of the effects, I think, of the app. So I don't know if there are any last questions, or should we end here? Yeah. Yeah, it's a good idea.
Yes, let's go to the bar.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Thank you both. Thank you, Amal. Thank you, ArteEast.